Before we start, I would like to share some important information to ensure an effective and professional webinar experience. Please be informed that this session is being recorded for quality and educational purposes. In order to maintain a stable internet connection, we have muted all participant microphones and disabled video feeds. We highly encourage engagement through our Q&A window. Feel free to submit any questions you may have for our speaker. These will be addressed in the designated question and answer period at the end of the presentation. Kindly note, the chat function will be deactivated following this introduction. For those seeking continuing education learning hours, please note that attendance is crucial. A minimum of 80% attendance is required for these hours to be accredited to your transcript. And lastly, please note that the presenter does not provide insurance, legal, or practice advice, and the OAA does not bear responsibility for errors or omissions in discussions during the webinar. For accessibility, we provide automated closed captioning service available in multiple languages to accommodate the needs of our diverse audience. But now, I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today's session. Please welcome Megan Nicoletti. Megan, over to you.
Thank you, Felix. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I was excited to hear that we had this many people interested in a presentation on the building code. I understand we have over 300 participants, and I had presented the same topic back at the OAA conference in May, where we had over 100 people. So very exciting. I'm happy to hear everybody's as interested in and as passionate about the building code as I am. But I do understand the interest. We have a new code coming out in January, and everybody's intrigued on what that content is. So I hope by the end of this session, you'll have a good understanding of those changes. I have prepared this presentation to be quite comprehensive. It is a lot of information to cover, so sit tight, get comfortable, try and stay awake. All the content that you need is on the slides. I've tried to give you code references as well, so it's a great reference tool, and I understand that a copy of this presentation will be made available to you after this. So you don't necessarily need to take notes. Everything will be provided directly on the slides. So let's get started, and again, thank you all for coming today. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Megan Nicoletti, and I am a partner at CodeNext. We are a building code and fire code consulting firm. We started in Toronto, but we have recently expanded out onto the Atlantic provinces with a new office out in Moncton. We offer code consulting services, building audit services, fire safety plans, and the whole gamut of fire protection and life safety requirements, including accessibility. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. We often get pegged as the bad guy, but we try to be your friend. We are your pat in the back. And hopefully by the time this presentation's done, you'll understand we have a really good knowledge of the code, and we're happy to share it and educate. So let's jump right in now. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the key dates, when this code comes out, when it becomes enforced. I'm going to speak to the format, and then I'm going to get into some of the more content of the code through the administrative changes, the technical changes. I'm going to speak to what's not being changed, because there's a lot of rumors out there, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So moving on. I always like to start with the why. Why are we having this presentation? Why do we have such a significant code change? And I want to give the background here. So this was the largest revision to the building code since it was originally adopted. As you can see, there are over 2,000 changes to the code. And the intention behind this is that we wanted to harmonize with the National Building Code. So what we've done is we've actually adopted the National Building Code. So for those that don't know, we have the National Building Code, which is our NBC, and it is the model code for which every provincial code has been based upon. So each province at its discretion can adopt its own provincial code. We have the Ontario Building Code, there's the Alberta Building Code, there's the BC Building Code, and what have you. They're all based on the model code, but through the adoption of the individual provincial standards, we found that there's some discrepancies in some of those code languages. So a requirement that may be enforced in Ontario may not be equally applied in Alberta. And this creates a lot of confusion, and especially in this new digital world that we're living in, where people are working beyond their local jurisdictions. We can now expand our offices, like myself, to the Atlantic provinces and take on work out there. But the codes out there might be different than what we're familiar with. So the intention is to harmonize it and get everybody on the same page, because really at the end of the day, fire protection and life safety, it doesn't change which province you live in. So this was a statistic that I found a little bit surprising, but when we were currently working off the 2012 Ontario Building Code, and I was surprised to see that that building code, the Ontario Building Code that we have, is aligned with the National Building Code already 71%. So like I said, we're based on the model code, but we've tweaked it to make it kind of specific to some Ontario requirements that may not be applicable in other provinces. So we are 71% aligned. However, even with these 2,000 changes that are about to drop, we still only get to 77%. So that was a little bit intriguing for me. People have asked me, do we expect it to fully harmonize with the National Building Code? And I don't believe that's the case because we are a very large province or country geographically. What happens in BC may not be the exact same as what happens in Quebec. Let's take snow loads, for example. There's very different criteria. So I think that from a harmonization perspective, we maybe will target about 80%, and I don't expect us to exceed that. So what we've done, Ontario, we have the new National Building Code. We're following the 2020 National Building Code with the Ontario Amendment, and this is coming out in January. So let's speak to some key dates. So as of January 1st, 2025, the new 2024 Ontario Building Code, we're calling it the 2024 Ontario Building Code, because it was released in May of this year, it will become effective. Now, what does that mean? That means that the date that you apply for building permit is the code that is enforced for your project. There's often a misconception. People assume that if you have to have a permit in hand to have that applicable code, but that's not the case. It's just the date that you apply for building permit. It can take years or months before you actually achieve a building permit, and there may be amendments to your drawing or to your design. But that being said, the code that is enforced for your project is the date that you apply for permit. So as of January 1st, if you apply for a permit post that date, then you would be governed by the new building code, the 2024 building code. But if you apply December 30th, which I hope everybody isn't scrambled to do so, then you're still governed under the 2012 Ontario Building Code. Now, to bridge the gap, because there's a lot of projects probably on your desk that are well underway and you're scrambling, and to avoid everybody kind of submitting napkin sketches to the city for a permit on December 31st, what they've done is they've allowed you to have a grace period. So up until March 31st, if you apply for permit between January 1st and March 31st, you can still be governed by the 2012 Ontario Building Code, provided you can show to the local jurisdiction that your project has been substantially completed up to the January 1st date. What substantially completed is, we don't know, and that might depend on your local jurisdiction. I have always been recommending to our clients that if your project is well underway and you're at the 60% stage, you'll probably be at about your 90% DD stage by the end of December. Open up the door to your local authorities and say, look, this is where we're at end of December. We can scramble and get it in December 31st, but ideally we probably will be applying maybe in February or March. So we would like an extension. And if you can show to them ahead of time, then they should be receptive to allowing you to apply the old code to your project. And the reason being is we don't want to enforce a hard deadline on this, because if your project is at the 90% day and you miss that deadline by 2 or 3 days, to go back and revise your project to meet the new code could be quite substantial and costly. And that's not the intention here. So there is that grace period up until March 31st. As of April 1st, all bets are off. If you apply for permit April 1st and onwards, you are governed by the 2024 building code, regardless of where you're at in your design stage. So that is our cutoff deadline. I've also heard rumor that local jurisdictions are going to be adopting an attestation form, and this form will be included in your design package that will state just a general line that says the project has been designed in accordance with whichever version of the building code you intend to apply for. So that attestation form will probably just be used from that January 1st to April 1st deadline, but it's going to advise the local jurisdiction which code you're using, the 2012 or the 2024, so that they can make their approvals accordingly. So we haven't seen those forms yet. We're not there yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if we did see those. So those are the key dates that we need to be mindful of. Again, take note that this is the day you apply for permit, not the day that you receive permit, okay? So what does the code look like? We all know the big, bulky, two-binder Ontario Building Code. Unfortunately, that format still stays. That is called our compendium, and it lives on for another probably 10 years at least. So we have those two big binders. That is the compendium. The technical requirements of the code are in volume 1. Volume 2 would be all of that associated guideline information, your appendices, your supplementary standards, your index, and what have you. We also have a digital version that's available, and I've included QR codes on the side of the page. And those QR codes will take you to links where you can download a copy of the building code. It is law. You are forced to design to the building code, so it has to be made available to you free of charge. So if you click on one of those PDFs, I believe, or QR codes, I believe the second one, the one in the middle, that one will direct you to a link that you can download a copy of the digital version of the Ontario Building Code, the 2024. It is PDF format. It is searchable, which is a lovely feature, but it is protected in the sense that you cannot alter it, you cannot highlight, and you cannot bookmark. So that is the restrictions for it. When you click that code, I believe it asks you to enter your email. You have to sign a waiver indicating that you're not going to print it and resell it, which is fair. And then they will provide you with that copy of the building code. As for e-laws, I'm not sure if anybody out there uses e-laws. E-laws is the online version. It's a website that we currently use that has the building code online. That is going away. We are no longer, or I have heard that the ministry is no longer supporting e-laws. It's going to be replaced with a single page document that says that Ontario has adopted the 2020 National Building Code with corresponding amendments. So it's going to be a single page document on e-laws. What I'm hopeful for, though, is we rely on e-laws to look at older editions of the code when we're assessing kind of a renovation project to understand the history of the building and how it was originally constructed. So I'm hoping that e-laws is maintained for accessing previous editions of the building code. It just will not have the 2024. Rumor has it the reason why is they didn't want to maintain it to keep it current, but we're not sure how those amendments for the code will be introduced and if they're going to be sending paper copies or you have to re-download a PDF. We probably won't know that until January 1st when it becomes enforced. The other thing to note is that we're governed by the 2020 National Building Code. That's the code that will be in effect with the Ontario Amendment. However, the National Building Code is currently out for public review for a new code. So we're anticipating the 2025 National Building Code to come into effect shortly. And that means that the Ontario Building Code, the 2024 Ontario Building Code, will most likely reference the 2025 National Building Code when it comes out. So we'll see an Ontario amendment to say, apply the 2025 National Building Code. Okay. They have amalgamated the documents, so everything is cohesive, everything lines up, the requirements, you don't have to open up two separate documents. For those that participated in my conference seminar, we had two separate documents at that time, but right now the compendium is one book that has kind of meshed together all the requirements of the National Building Code and the OAA, or the OA, Ontario Amendment, into one document. So that's what the format of the new code looks like. A print version is not yet available, but there is a link in the bottom QR code. You can put your name on a list and they will send you a copy of the printed, send you an email notifying you when the printed copy does become available. And then you can go on, but you do have to purchase if you want to make that printed copy. So a printed compendium, the big binder, will be available. We're anticipating it by the end of the year. So let's get into some of those technical requirements now. Moving on into the administrative side. So the administrative side, no big changes here. This is just to align with the new format of the code because, like I said, we adopted the National Building Code and it does read a little bit differently than Ontario. We've got some revisions to our functional statements. We've got some new and removed defined terms. So we've dropped the definition for house and we've replaced that with a secondary suite. Under the National Building Code, there were size limitations for a secondary suite, but Ontario has adopted through the amendment its own specific requirements, which didn't govern size for secondary suites. They've included definitions for demountable stages. We've got a new agricultural occupancy, so there's some new definitions to go through there. They've also updated the reference standards. So this is that table at the beginning of your building code, which says which edition of the reference standards, so those would be like your NFPA guidelines, which year you're going to use. So like I said, we're using the 2012 Ontario Building Code right now. If to use an example, NFPA 13, our sprinkler standard, the Ontario Building Code requires that we use the 2013 version of NFPA 13. However, there's a 2019 version out there, but by law, we're not required to follow that 2019 version. We only have to follow the requirements of 2013. Clearly, it's a bit outdated, so the new code will update all of those years. And under the new code, for example, we would be using the 2019 NFPA 13 document. So if you're using any reference standards from the building code, just make sure you double check on those years to make sure that you're using the corresponding and the referenced edition that's noted in that table at the beginning. So mostly just administrative changes, like I said, some word changes, and just identifying the structure of the code to better align with Ontario. That's what we found in part 1 for the changes. Part 2. Part 2 is a previously reserved section of the building code, i.e. a blank page. We've now filled it in and we have a new major occupancy. We have group G, and these are our agricultural occupancies. The categories are very similar to what we would find for an assembly occupancy. So we have divisions 1 through 4, and these are really intended to govern our farm buildings, okay? The agricultural occupancies are, like I said, aligned with the assembly occupancies. So G1, those are our high hazard agricultural occupancies. So those would be kind of like our cannabis facilities where we've got extraction in them. Group G2 would be anything that doesn't fit any of the other buckets, very similar to what we do for our Group A Division 2 occupancies. Group G3, those are our greenhouses. And Group G4, those agricultural occupancies with no human occupants. As a code consultant, we are wordsmiths. It takes a long time to write a code. We spend weeks debating specific wording because wording can affect the intention of that sentence. So key note here, G4, agricultural occupancies with no human occupants. That does not include livestock. So you could have a barn that has a lot of livestock in it and it could still be classified as group G4. It just depends on the human occupants. So as for farm buildings, they've structured it very similar to align with how we would define a Part 3 versus a Part 9 building. So in Ontario, we also have the Farm Code. Okay, so the Farm Code has been in existence for a very long time, and the Farm Code has been intended to govern those farm agricultural type buildings. However, the requirements in the Farm Code were very vague. So they basically said, well, if there's going to be people in there, you should protect them and make sure that they can get out. But it didn't really get descriptive or quantify any specific requirements. What we're finding now is that these farm buildings are no longer being used for the purposes that they were originally intended. We're putting a lot of weddings in barns now. We've got cannabis extraction facilities. We've got vertical farming. And so these spaces are becoming much more different than what was originally intended when they wrote the Farm Code. So what we've done is we've pulled those requirements into the building code, but we've differentiated between kind of large and small buildings, farm buildings. So large farm buildings are going to be governed by the building code. Small farm buildings will still maintain coverage under the National Farm Building Code. Okay, so small buildings, and the threshold is very similar, like I said, to Part 3 and Part 9. If you're more than 3 stories or more than 600 meters squared, you are considered a large farm building and you're going to be governed by the Ontario Building Code. If you're less than those threshold requirements, then you would stay under the National Farm Building Code. Okay. The requirements in Part 2 for these large farm type buildings, it's going to cover fire protection, occupant safety, structural loads, procedures, and HVAC systems. So it's really intended to ensure the safety of occupants in that building and to protect the building that if there ever was an event. Because if you think typically our farm buildings, our agricultural buildings, they were really intended to just burn in place. There was never any firefighting measures available to access them. They may or may not have access to water. But now that we're putting these more hazardous operations within them, or we have a more dense occupant load, we found the need to protect them. So that's the intention here with Part 2. Moving on from Part 2, we get into Part 3. Part 3 is really kind of the meat of the presentation here. So I've given you specific code requirements right on the left there, and I've identified all the updated changes. So I'm going to kind of blaze through them. You will have access to these slides, so you can look at them more thoroughly. I'm always available for questions. My QR code will be at the end for my contact information. Please reach out. I'm happy to educate. But I'm going to blaze through these, but everything you need should be on the slides, and I can answer questions at the end. But like I said, most of the content is on the slides. So let's start with the section 3.1 for general. A lot of the requirements in here were clarity. They were either intended to address gaps in the code where there were no requirements, or they're intended to just kind of clean up some language to make it a little bit more user-friendly. So the first one there, 3125 and 3127, this was intended to provide clarity for restaurants. So to back it up and give an analogy to kind of clarify this statement, restaurants, if they're small enough, restaurants as a whole are considered an assembly occupancy, okay? Under Part 9, you cannot have a project of an assembly occupancy, regardless of size. So assembly occupancies have to be designed per Part 3 requirements. So as a restaurant, you are considered an assembly occupancy and you have to be designed to Part 3. This didn't make sense for a lot of those kind of smaller restaurants, those ones, you know, for those of you that are in Toronto, you know, that are along the Danforth, or those of you that are in other jurisdictions where you have those kind of single story with a residential unit above restaurants that are quite small in scale, you know, to design them as an A2 is quite conservative. So there was always a requirement in our building code that said restaurants that have less than 30 seats could be considered a Group E occupancy. And there's a bit of a gap there. Some people thought, oh, well, if I'm a Group E, then I'm not an A2, then I can jump back into Part 9 and design my restaurant to be Part 9 as a Group E. That's never been the intention. The intention is that all restaurants live and are designed under Part 3. And so this requirement was put there to provide clarity on that clause. There's clarification on fire separation requirements between major occupancies. This is basically just an editorial update. They've removed a lot of prohibited occupancies. We found with, there's been a lot of science and a lot of data that's come through the industry with respect to kind of combustible materials, combustible construction. We learned a lot from Grenfell. So you're going to see that this code has really evolved to kind of take note of that science, and you're going to see a lot more allowances, especially with respect to combustible occupancies. So there's a removal of a lot of prohibited occupancies in these kind of mid-rise combustible construction. And you're going to see a lot of our additional prescriptive requirements for exterior cladding. You're going to be allowed to do it. In Ontario, we had a limit that you couldn't have combustible cladding more than 6 stories in residential, but we've removed that height requirement. So there's more allowances there. There's very specific guidelines that have been adopted to address those. So yes, you can do it, but you have to follow the path in the code to do it correctly. So your exterior walls have to be tested accordingly. You can only use specific products. So it is well defined, but you are allowed to do it now under the new code. Okay. Continuing on, 318, we've adopted all the National Building Code requirements for the termination of fire separations and joints. This one is more of an intuitive requirement. You know, I thought it was intuitive that if you have a vertical fire separation, it must terminate at a horizontal fire separation. You have to create a box. But that was not really well defined in the code. It only spoke to horizontal service spaces. So they've added clarity and adopted the National Building Code requirement for that. And they've also addressed some of the gaps. So hold open devices. If your building doesn't have a fire alarm system, how are you going to release that hold open device? So they've included provisions for the smoke detector to operate that hold open device when your building doesn't have a fire alarm. Another adjustment in language was tightly fit. So if we have penetrations of any fire separation, you are permitted to not include fire stop provided they were tightly fit. Tightly fit is discrepant. Tightly fit is interpretive. I have seen many circumstances where tightly fit has included stuffing a sock around the opening. Aluminum foil has been done. I've seen blankets. I've seen paper towels. That does not mean tightly fit. So they've changed all the language, all the references to tightly fit and replaced them with cast in place. This is kind of more aligned with industry language. We all know what cast in place meant, and it's, you know, intended to remove all those kind of stuffing the holes of non-fire stop material. We've adopted the National Building Code requirements for interior finish to better align with the fire code requirements. So make sure you check that. And they've also included provisions for interior finishes for therapeutic bathing. So we have an aging population. So we have a lot more concerns with respect to how to design our Group B occupancies. And so flame spread rating, smoke developed classification for therapeutic bathing, because we're seeing more of it as our population ages. We're also seeing a tightening up of occupant load. So as you all know, we can design our occupant load based on factored occupant load or program occupant load. Factored occupant load, we're going to take the area of the room and divide it by the factors in the table provided by the code, and it's going to tell us how many people can fit in that space. However, how many people that fit in that space may not really align with your project goals, and maybe you might be able to fit 1,000 people, but if you're only employing 100, then why design the space to support 1,000 people? That's a lot of toilets. So in the past, we've always kind of leaned on this program occupant load that suited the needs of the operator. The cities are starting to push back on that, and so now they're going to be pushing more on a factored occupant load, which is going to mean more washrooms and larger exits. So be mindful of that. There's going to be less leniency on using these program occupant loads, and the reason being is we have to think for the lifespan of the building. We design a space and we say that it has a program occupant load of, say, 20 persons for that room. The only way of knowing that you have 20-person limit on that room is you've got a placard up on the wall, other code requirement. Over time, somebody comes in to repaint that room, they take the placard off, they sell the building, and that placard never goes back up. And that history is lost. And so now the next user group comes in and, all right, well, they've got 40 people that they just use the space, none the wiser. So the intention with this requirement is really to just ensure for the lifespan of the building that it still remains safe and that you have sufficient number of exits and sufficient number of washrooms. So we're seeing a bit of pushback on these program occupant loads. Continuing on into 3.2. This was a great addition. I really like to see this one. In Ontario, if you were working on any industrial facility and you have kind of those maintenance platforms to service equipment, when I say maintenance platforms, these are like your catwalks. We're not talking about mezzanines here. Ontario, you were previously limited to 4 persons on a platform. The National Building Code did not have that requirement, that limit of 4 persons. So if you were a federally governed building, you could have 10 people on your platform. And in Ontario, you could only have 4. And there was not really any rhyme or reason to why we were capped at 4 people. Like, is 5 people risky, but 4 is okay? So they've dropped that limit. So you're allowed to do inspection platforms and catwalks, provided that they are non-combustible construction, and there's no reference to the occupant load. There's also technical changes throughout subsection 3.2.2. So these are your construction classifications, your Group C up to 6 stories, sprinklers, or any area, any height. That's just really to align with all of the new requirements for encapsulated mass timber and changes to the article. But you're also going to see an increase in the number of buildings required to be sprinklered. There is a move in the industry to provide more sprinkler coverage into spaces. We found that out with our care occupancy. There was the date that every building has to be sprinklered as of January 1st, 2025. We all work in, or some of us work in high-rise office towers that are unsprinkled. If we were to build them today, they'd need to be sprinkled. So that is where the industry is moving. So expect to see more language for sprinklered buildings. Some general clauses, lighting levels, removal of gypsum board from exterior soffits, emergency power, big change for emergency power. These requirements were only applicable in the past to high buildings. They've dropped that provision for high buildings, so they're now applicable to all buildings. So you need emergency power for firefighting water, and you need emergency power for your, you need to locate your emergency generator in a 2-hour room. Like I said, it was only applicable to high buildings in the past, but now it's applicable to all buildings. Sprinkler systems. This one was actually a sad loss, but I understand the intention here. We always had an article. So if you designed your building under your 3.2.2 construction classification, it said that your building, had to have 1-hour fire rated floor assemblies, combustible or non-combustible construction. Your roof required a 1-hour fire resistance rating. But then there was always that clause, and it was under 3.2.2.17, where it said you didn't need to rate your roof if your building is sprinklered. Well, in the new edition of the Ontario Code, or Ontario Building Code, they have removed that. So you are no longer exempt, and you now have to sprinkler your roof regardless of whether you have a fire rating. Or sorry, you now have to rate your roof regardless to whether or not you are sprinklered. So we've lost that exemption. So roofs will always have a fire resistance rating if the 3.2.2 classification warrants it. This is probably one of the biggest changes that will have the most impact on your project. In a building where an upper level requires sprinkler protection, sprinklers are required on all levels below. To put that into context, we're doing a lot of renovation work where we have these high-rise residential buildings and they've got like a rooftop amenity pool or an amenity space, it's indoor. And the building owner says, oh, rent's a premium, I could have a couple suites up there and nobody uses the pool. So I would like to renovate that rooftop area and put in some new residential suites. Or, I've got this storage room that's no longer used and I'm going to, convert it to an apartment so that I can start getting rent. Under the building code, under part 11, there is a requirement that says if you add residential suites, that the new suites must be sprinklered. So in the past, we would just sprinkler those new residential suites and the rest of the building would be grandfathered under part 11. Now, if we sprinkler that one unit, we have to sprinkler everything, every floor below that unit. Okay, so that's pretty significant, especially when you consider that this building is probably occupied. And construction would be very difficult to do so. So that's just a major one. Another example that you might come across is residential garbage rooms with chutes. Those rooms have to be sprinklered. Whether or not your building is sprinklered, those rooms have to be sprinklered. So if you have a residential garbage room on your ground floor and you have a below grade parking level, you have to sprinkler your below grade parking level. Okay, anything below a sprinklered room has to be sprinklered fully. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot of P1 level garage room or garbage rooms. So that's when we'll have significant cost implications, not just from running pipe and complications with occupied buildings, but also be mindful of your water supply to the building, right? That may have to be improved. We've also expanded the application of NFPA 13D to cover townhouses. We're seeing a lot of more townhouse construction as densification occurs. So we want to really capture that under NFPA 13D clearly because in the past it's been pushed into NFPA 13, the larger sprinkler standard. So it's intended that townhouses would be governed under NFPA 13D. They've also adopted the requirement for draft stops and closely spaced sprinklers directly into our building code. These are around your atrium opening. So most of you've all seen the glass baffles that kind of frame the floor opening. Those requirements were always pulled from NFPA 13, but they've decided to pull them out directly into our building code for interconnected floor spaces. So that requirement is no longer a cross-reference, but directly within the body of our code. Fire alarm systems. This one is a common sense application. Sprinkler buildings require a fire alarm system. Ontario is the only province that didn't mandate this. And I'll give you an example so you understand it. I'm working on a project. It's a sewage treatment plant. It's not occupied. Maintenance personnel do not need to visit it on a regular basis. So people maybe stop in once a week at most, maybe twice a month. So it's not attended regularly. And on that project, it is sprinklered. Maintenance were going through and doing some work and one of them damaged a sprinkler pipe. It didn't rupture, but it just got damaged. But it got damaged enough that it eventually did rupture after those maintenance workers had left the site. So that sprinkler system went into active release and nobody was there to notice it. And it went, and it went, and it went because it's connected to municipal water. So it's basically an unending water flow and nobody was aware of it. So clearly this is not an ideal situation and we need to make some kind of notification that where a sprinkler system has been initiated, somebody is alerted to it. So by connecting it to a fire alarm system, that will allow people to be notified of when that sprinkler system does discharge. So that's a good one. Like I said, Ontario was the only province that did not have that line in our code. They've removed the provision to notify the fire department in a group B, F1, high buildings and buildings with interconnected floor space where you're equipped with a single stage fire alarm system. For those that don't know, a single stage fire alarm system is one where the fire alarm goes off, everybody gets out, okay? The two-stage fire alarm system is where you don't want everybody to leave at the same time. You want to investigate that point of fire, maybe evacuate those people who are near to the fire, and everybody else remains in place. We've all been in buildings before where the fire alarm's gone off and they come on and make an announcement and hi, there's been a fire. Local fire services or building operators are investigating. Please remain in place until directed otherwise. That would be a two-stage fire alarm system. So they've removed the provision to notify fire department when you have a single stage. And they've included, I guess this is becoming much more common, helicopter landing pads. I haven't had any projects come across my desk that included these, but apparently it's a thing now that needs to be in the code. And so clearly landing a helicopter on a building is a bit risky. So we want a way to notify that if there is an incident. So they want fire alarm devices such as telephones and manual pull stations to notify people of an event. So that's, again, a pretty reasonable requirement here. Requirement for low frequency signals and residential occupancies. This is an interesting one. I did a test. I have a small daughter, and I had a group of people over, and we did a test because apparently in schools nowadays, children are setting their ringtones to have a low frequency because those who are older can't hear that tone. So kids in school are setting their ringtones to have these frequencies, and their phones are ringing. They can all hear it. The teacher, who is older, cannot. So we did the little test, and it is evident. If there's tests you can do online where you set a tone, and you'll notice that the younger can hear the higher tones better than the people who are older. So with that, we found that there was a need to upgrade fire alarm systems so that people could actually hear them. Fire alarm systems also never addressed closed doors. So there's a requirement here now that you have to be able to close all the doors and still hear the fire alarm system and hit those sound pressure levels. We've increased the sound pressure level limit from 100 to 110 dBA. And the intention, again, is to make sure that everybody can hear it and to make it more of an inclusive environment and respecting our aging population. And we've been seeing an increase in carbon monoxide alarms as required in other parts. So all good intentions here. Standpipe systems. So happy to see this. I wish I could do a raise of hands on how many of you have proposed the standpipe alternative solution to locate a standpipe system in a stairwell. For those of you that haven't, just to give background, in Ontario, we have those hose cabinets. You walk through a building, you'll have a hose cabinet on a wall. So it's typically a red cabinet. It's got a whole wheel of hosing strung inside that cabinet. Fire extinguishers are sometimes located in there, and there's valves for connection. Local fire services don't like to use them because they're dependent on the building operator maintaining those hoses. I've seen Tim Hortons cups shoved in them. I've seen them fall off. It's impossible to rehang those hoses, so people just shove them back in, and they're not often maintained, so local fire services never like to rely on them. But it was in the code, we had to do it. That being said, a lot of our projects would write an alternative solution to use the national building code requirements, which took that all away, and we locate a valve in our stair where firefighters can come up, connect to that valve, and fight the fire from the exit stair. We had to write an alternative solution because we are applying the national building code to a project that would have been governed by the Ontario building code. So Ontario has streamlined, we have harmonized, fantastic. We now have adopted the national building code requirements for standpipes. Gone are the days of our hose cabinets on the floor, and we've got those standpipe valves in the stairs. That's the new requirement. But with that, we've got increased water pressure requirements, and we've got hose stations throughout the floor. Now, it's not necessarily the hose, but it's the valves to give you the sufficient coverage that you might need. Okay. We've also maintained the exemption for 4-story townhouse buildings, which is really good, and I'm surprised that the National Model Code won't adopt this in the future. But anything that's over 3 stories, I believe, needs to have a standpipe system, and we often see these 4-story stacked townhouses. It seems silly to put a standpipe system in a 4-story stacked townhouse building because it's never intended to be used by the building operator or the homeowner. It's for trained personnel only, i.e. firefighters. And in these types of buildings, firefighters don't typically respond from the inside. They fight the fire from the outside. So it becomes moot. And it's, prone to being tampered with. Children, something fun to play with, probably won't be maintained. So Ontario has always had that exemption to not put standpipes in townhouse buildings that are 4 stories, and we've kept that. So that has remained unchanged. So moving forward, we're going to put those standpipes in the stairs. That being said, there's a bit of a gap in the code. What do we do now? We know this is coming, but for projects that are going in for permit today, do we still have to put the hose cabinets on the floor? I can't answer that. That's going to be depending on your local jurisdictions. I did just do a project that went for permit last week, and the city said we still had to write the alternative solution because we're under the 2012 building code, even knowing that this is coming. So it's going to depend on your local authorities. I suggest you speak with them now and figure out, if you are applying for permit, if you choose to adopt this requirement that's coming in 2024, but your project is still governed under the 2012 code, okay? Because they may still require that alternative solution. Interconnected floor space, another big change here. This one surprised me. There is a requirement for interconnected floor space. So interconnected floor space are atriums, and we were always allowed, or we were given an exemption to not protect our interconnected floor space, provided it was proposed only in the ground and second floor, or the ground and the basement, but not both. Okay, so you were exempt from an interconnected floor space requirements if you were just those 2 floors above or 2 floors below. There was another exemption too, that you did not have to protect your interconnected floor space if your opening consisted of a stairway, moving walkway, escalator, and the opening was not more than 10 meters squared. In Ontario, we were always given an allowance of up to 20 meters squared, and that allowance was to allow for side-by-side escalators. You couldn't fit an up and a down escalator in a 10-meter square opening. You can make your floor Swiss cheese, so you could have located them all which way, but the requirement was always to allow for those double escalators, so 20 meters squared. In the new code, they have removed the word stair. So exemptions for protection are restricted to incline moving walkways and escalators, and it does not include stairs. So think of all of those fancy tenant suites, those lawyers' offices that have multiple floors, and they have that beautiful communication stair that's open to connect. It's not used for exiting, but it's just an open communication stair. It is no longer permitted. It has to be enclosed. It has to be protected to maintain the integrity of the floor-to-floor fire separations, or you design it as an interconnected floor space with all special protection measures. So this is very significant. I can see a lot of people pushing for permit under the 2012 to allow for these open stairs. If they're there, they're grandfathered. There's no obligation to enclose them, but you will not be able to design any open stairs moving forward unless you are the ground and second floor or the ground and basement level. Okay, so this was a really big one. We have also adopted all the National Building Code requirements associated with interconnected floor spaces. So if you recall in Ontario, if you did have to protect it, they had very specific requirements. You had to fit that cylinder in the space, and there was very specific requirements for that cylinder. We did away with that. That's no longer required. You don't have to have your opening be a specific size. So that was nice, but they did compensate on that. And what they did was they limited the combustible content. So the combustible content follows the National Building Code requirements, and there are limits on it. Whereas in Ontario previously, there were no limits on the combustible content. What is combustible content? This is your furnishings. This is your grain walls. This is I guess that would mostly be it, furnishing. But yeah, combustible content. We're going to see a lot, I think, marble, wrought iron furniture moving forward. Maybe a good thing. But yeah, be mindful of that there are limits on the combustible content within your space. Wall finishes would be exempt because it was governed by interior finish requirements. So it's really just kind of the furnishings in those lobby areas and atrium spaces. They've also revised the air changes per hour. So our mechanical exhaust system must be capable of 4 air changes per hour. Previously it was 6. And then draft stops, closely spaced sprinklers around the opening. That kind of maintains. No other changes with respect to interconnected floor spaces. Egress, not a lot of big changes here. They did make minimal dimensional changes with respect to rooms that are served by a single means of egress. So in the past, your single means of egress, you're permitted, say in a group C, if your room was not more than 150 meters squared and your travel distance to that door was not more than 25 meters. They've actually lowered those thresholds. So for group C, they've gone from 150 meters squared to 100 meters squared, and they've reduced the travel distance from 25 down to 15. Group E went from 200 to 150 for area and 25 to 15 meters for travel distance. What they're finding is that, they need to tighten up the evacuation on getting people out of these rooms that are served by a single means of egress. So that was one of the big changes to allow for single means of egress. The other one was that they increased the minimum clear door width to 850. Previously, egress doors, exit doors were all 790, but they've gone up and they've made it 850 consistently across the board. This one I was actually surprised to see, and this is really counterintuitive to the harmonization requirements, but Ontario has a single line in it that says you are not allowed to put a mag lock in a school. We're working with a lot of different school boards across the province to address what we call elopers, where children are running out of schools unattended and they're fast and teachers can't catch them quickly. And, we don't want to expose them to that risk. So we want to look at putting some kind of security hardware on these doors to delay that evacuation. Clearly, a delay in evacuation goes against everything I believe in, so we want to look to do it safely. And a maglock is the way to do it, right? It's going to delay people, but not in a fashion that would delay them to an extent that could be risky. But in Ontario, there's that specific requirement that says we cannot have maglocks in a school. Ontario is the only province that has this. Alberta actually has maglocks on their schools, not necessarily to address eloping students, but perhaps for lockdown purposes. So we're working on doing potentially a code change request to modify this, because I believe this is kind of a Dalton McGuinty legacy requirement, and a little bit out of date for today's society. But Ontario did carry this one through. So this was pulled into the 2024 National Building Code. We've maintained all of our comprehensive requirements for assembly occupancy, residential occupancy, and hazardous areas. What does that mean? In our codes, we have those kind of specific sections where like 3333, 335, 336 that address assembly occupancies. It's going to give you all your aisle requirements and library requirements, and then group B, it gets into the hospital and long-term care requirements. And we've got specific sections to address those. We've kept that. Nothing has changed, but we adopted it. We kept Ontario's version versus the National Building Code requirements are just kind of summarized all together in one page. Another intuitive one here is that we've got provisions for safety glazing and assembly occupancies. So if you have kind of a glass wall, it's got to be safety glass. Again, that just seems intuitive and good engineering practice for that one. Exits, we've harmonized our language to align with the National Building Code. We all love reading code. Reading code is fun. It's complicated. They like double negatives. It's a little bit of a choose your own adventure. Where's Waldo exercise, except as permitted by blah, 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 blah. Then you are allowed to do this if blah, 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 blah does allow you. So that was how our kind of exit section read. It was in sentence structure before, but they've modified it to harmonize with the National Building Code, and they put it into a table. So it's much better off. So the only thing to really be mindful with respect to exits is that exit width for doors has increased from 790 up to 850. They provided clarification minimum exit widths for group C occupancy and B3 occupancies by adopting the minimum widths under the National Building Code. This was an interesting one. I actually joked about this at the conference and got some good ideas on what the intention was on this one. I'm still not quite sure, but exit signs have to be equipped with tactile information. That's all it says. What does that mean? Does that mean our green running man signs have to have tactile? Well, that doesn't make sense. That's not reachable. So what I believe the intention with this is to make exit signs inclusive, maybe mounting a placard on the wall beside an exit door that includes tactile information to be helpful for evacuation for all. So I think that's the intention there, but there are no prescriptive requirements on the code to define what they really intended by this. So it is discretionary to the designer at this time. Handrail dimensions have been modified to align with the National Building Code. In Ontario, currently, we're stuck to kind of that circular profile or the rectangular profile, but we've aligned with the National Building Code to give you more allowances. And we've revised all ramp slopes to be 1 in 12, okay? Except for industrial occupancies, but previously we had different ramp slopes depending on the occupancy of your space and whether it's an exterior ramp. We've harmonized it. It's just 1 in 12. Only one number for you to remember now. Guards and mezzanines, big changes here. Guards, we need guards around skylights for roof assembly if you're occupied. Again, I thought that was already done. I've seen most people do that, but now it's actually in the code and you have to do it. Clearly, we don't want people in an occupied roof area from walking across a skylight if it's not designed to be structurally strong enough. So we want a guard around it. Big changes to mezzanine. They've really tightened up the language on mezzanine. So if you have a very large mezzanine that's over 500 meters squared, typically we find these more in industrial occupancies, it has to be enclosed. Okay, it can still be classified as a mezzanine, but it has to be enclosed. Okay, the intention is that they're large spaces, they're almost equivalent to a floor. So let's provide an increased level of protection for these mezzanine occupants from a fire event that may occur on the floor below. So we have to enclose our mezzanines. And there's also a requirement that the mezzanine, if it's over 500 meters squared, be served by independent exits at that floor level. No more open stairs. Stairs have to be enclosed. They've also reduced the maximum travel areas and travel distances, maximum areas and travel distances for mezzanines on egressing through the floor level below. And at least half of your egress have to be an exit stair. So all mezzanines, regardless of size, need to have at least one enclosed exit stair. There's an increased risk for occupants on a mezzanine level. And our intention always with mezzanines is that people who are up there have early warning of an event that's happening on the floor level below. They're going to hear it by people, oh, look, there's a fire. They're going to hear it without any walls or any open obstructions. They're going to smell it when they're up there. So the smoke is going to rise and they're going to have that central awareness of it. And they're going to be able to see it. They can peer over a railing and see the fire below, and they can make their evacuation accordingly. But they do have to evacuate longer because they have to walk across the mezzanine, down an open stair, across the lower floor level before they reach a place of safety. So that is an increased risk that the new code is coming in to tighten up and try and reduce that risk for mezzanine occupants. So you're going to see a lot of requirements here that are going to limit your mezzanines. So I can see a push for people applying for the 2012 code to get in to not have these restrictions on their mezzanines. Service facilities, these are just kind of filling in some gaps on the code. So where we have service appliances outside a building, we get a lot of requests like, oh, I'm going to put my transformer here. Is there any concerns with respect to this exit door? So there's some requirements there on locating those service appliances and really just their proximity to vents and doors. There's a lot more requirements on how to design your ducts. It's going to cover materials, connectors, taping, what have you, but there's a lot of requirements under 365 for the design of ducts. And they've removed the provision that if you have a room, chute, or bin for refuge or linen, previously, if this was the only sprinkler space in your building, we would tap into the Standpipe system to supply water to that sprinkler system, but you're no longer allowed to do that, which means you have to run independent sprinkler lines for this room. And going back to my previous slide, if we're sprinkling this room, what are we doing? We're sprinkling everything below it. Health requirements, we've kind of kept, these are kind of our washrooms, our section 3.7, we've kept ours, nothing's really changed here. National Building Code does address washrooms quite differently, but Ontario has kept all the tables that we've all become familiar with it. And we've kept that 14 meter squared factor for office occupancies for determining the number of washrooms required. And they've allowed us now to build washrooms based on the number of staff intended for a industrial occupancy. So just be mindful in an industrial occupancy, you have to consider a shift change. So if you have 100 people working in your warehouse space, you have to design washrooms to support 200 people, okay? The reason being is those 100 people, when they're coming off their shift, are going to be replaced by the 100 people who are currently in the building. It's not intended that the 100 people who are coming off shift leave the building and then the new shift enters. They will simultaneously be in the building together. So we need enough washrooms to support a shift change. So always double your occupancy when you're designing washrooms for industrial facilities. Barrier-free path of travel. We have the code is ever evolving, including more barrier-free requirements. The biggest changes with this are with respect to building entrances and doors. The new code is going to require that all entrances to your building be designed to be barrier-free accessible. Currently, under our 2012 code, only the principal entrance and a proportion of your entrance doors need to be accessible. So moving forward, be mindful that all entrance doors need to be accessible. Also be mindful that this does not extend to exit doors. It's only entrance doors. They've got an exemption for barrier-free path of travel in low-rise buildings, 2 stories under certain conditions. That's kind of to provide clarity where the Part 11 requirements kick in. Exterior walks have require an alternating texture adjacent to it to help identify the location of that exterior walk. This one was surprising. This was shocking and maybe a bit disappointing. We have reduced our clear door width to align with the National Building Code. Ontario, we needed an 860 millimeter clear door. National Building Code required 850. We have gone and adopted the National Building Code, so our door widths are back to 850. For those of you that design doors, that correlates from going from a 915 door, will provide 850 clear width, to a 965 clear door, which would provide the 860 clear width. So we're going back to the 915 door. I don't understand the intention of this. We do have bigger wheelchairs and scooters that could benefit from this increased width and navigating through a doorway. We were there. We were all designing 860 clear doors, but I understand the harmonization that a door is a door and all doors should be the same. So I'm hoping that the National Building Code will eventually expand to 860, but until such time, we're back to 850. We've also increased the ramp size for barrier-free ramps from 1 meter wide to 1,700. Okay, so increased accessibility there. Barrier-free signs and services, a lot of requirements for signage, which is really good to see. We need signage on exits, doors with meg locks, crossover floors, floor numbers within stairs, and that should include braille and tactile characters. We've also got requirements now for accessible service counters. These were not in the code. The only requirement for counters really in the code was the shelves for counters for telephones, which we don't even see anymore. So we've got some guidance on that. And then assistive listening devices and adaptive technology at information service counters and assembly occupancies. So think in the mall, those mall directories, we want to make sure that they have a list of assistive listening systems or adaptive technology so that people can utilize that information. We've also defined dimensional requirements for passenger elevating devices. So this was good. We always referred to CAN CSA B651, I believe it was. We've pulled those requirements for the size, essentially our Lula lifts, directly into the code. So you can go to our building code to refer to the requirements on how to size those elevators. We've got language now that if you have a change room, then at least one of the showers and one of the change rooms need to be designed to be accessible, which is a good thing. And accessible water bottle refilling stations. We're seeing them everywhere. So now there's code requirements on how to actually design them. Interesting thing to note, accessible water bottle refill stations are not required by code. The language is simply, if you provide them, this is how they should be designed. Okay? Again, good practice. We're seeing them a lot and they're actually replacing a lot of the water fountains. Rapid transit stations. It still blows my mind that we can design an entire transit station in 7 pages of the building code. But that being said, we've got some new changes to our code. These really align with some of the alternative solutions that are typically applied for these spaces. One of them is an elevator. So if you think of any subway system that you've occurred or been on, there's always an elevator that serves from kind of the concourse or a grade, and it serves down to the platform level. Under the Ontario Building Code, that elevator is a conventional elevator and it must be located in a fire-rated shaft. However, from a security standpoint, we want that elevator to be glass. For anybody who's traveling solo late at night, they don't want to be getting onto an elevator that has no eyes on it with another person because there's a risk of security there. So we want those to be glass, but we were never allowed to under the code. So under this code change, we can do so now. There's also a requirement that we need a measure N vestibule, a pressurized vestibule, where our transit system interfaces with a building. This is to prevent smoke spread into the transit station from the building and vice versa. So that's a good one. Intuitively, we don't need a guard at the platform edge. Not surprising. And we've revised the egress requirements for turnstiles and fare collection gates. They were very narrow under the previous edition of the code. I think it was like 470 or 490 millimeters. So they've gone up to better accommodate the width of a person. Demountable stages and support structures. This is a whole new section of the code. This is intended to address those large concert stages that temporarily get constructed. There's been a lot of fatalities with these because in the past they were never required to be designed. So it could be just put up by the band themselves if they wished. So we've got this whole new subsection that's intended to govern these construction of these larger stages, and it's going to cover your occupant load, egress guards, clearances, flame resistance, firefighting, structural systems to make sure that they're designed accordingly and by the appropriate person so that we don't have any future fatalities. Toronto's probably most recent one would be the Radiohead concert where a technician lost his life due to failure of the scaffolding system, I believe. Wind is usually the cause. Mexico had a large fatality. There was one in Spain where wind uplifts the stage and or the structure holding all the lights, and you've got a dense occupant load right below. So we want to design these accordingly and protect all the people who are going to be thereabouts them. Part 9, not a lot of changes for Part 9. Biggest section of the code, and they had the least number of changes. Lateral bracing, wind and earthquake loads, that's all going to be added to Part 9 buildings. Previously, we did not have lateral bracing requirements for Part 9. That was only in Part 3 buildings. We've added polypropylene siding requirements. We've expanded HVAC requirements, and we have revoked the energy efficiency section under 936 of the National Building Code because Ontario has its own requirements. So that's all that's changed in Part 9, which I was quite surprised to see. 2 more slides. No changes. So what's staying? Part 8 sewage systems is currently in Ontario, whereas Part 8 in the National Building Code is safety during construction and demolition on construction sites. I like that section. That's what defines kind of what we're going to hoard our spaces to and how we're going to protect those partially occupied buildings. I thought we would actually adopt that and, maybe make a new part in our code, but we didn't. Feedback I've gotten is that we didn't want to take on the liability that, any construction requirements should be left to the contractor and the developer. So if we pull it into our building code, then it falls to the ownership of the design team. So I get that. We can still use the National Building Code requirements as guidance. We're just not enforced on it. So we kept our sewage systems. We kept part 10, part 11. There were a lot of rumors that we would lose those sections under the harmonization, but Ontario kept them. And it wouldn't surprise me if I see the model codes actually follow suit and adopt them therein. Energy conservation, nothing's changed. Everything remains the same with respect to energy. SB 10, SB 12, the Energy Act or Energy Code, nothing has changed in that regard. There's rumor that there will be changes, but as of yet, nothing has happened. So we continue on that energy conservation path and energy efficiency. We've kept all our supplementary standards, SB 2, SB 3, SB 4, design behind buildings, component additive method, glass and guards, all those have stayed. National Building Code didn't have them. In Division C, we've kept that as well. That's mostly our administrative stuff, governing permits, alternative solutions, when you need an architect, when you need an engineer. Again, those are very specific Ontario requirements because we have the OAA that the National Building Code wouldn't have. So we've kept those requirements. And what hasn't changed, these were rumors that came out and that may be adopted. They just didn't have time to do it. So keep these on your radar because we may expect to see these. Home type care occupancy, group B4, we have an aging population, we have a housing crisis, and we have an increased cost of living. So what a lot of families are expanding and pulling in their elderly to come live with them. And with that, they may have to hire someone to come in and care for that person. So we're kind of seeing these home type care occupancies occurring more frequently. So now maybe we should look for some design requirements to protect those people because they won't be able to evacuate the same way from a house that we would, typically expect a homeowner to. Climbability requirements for guards. Ontario is still a little bit vague on what is climbable. National Building Code has some great graphics in its appendix. I was hoping we would adopt that, but we haven't yet. Energy efficiency, like we've all heard those rumors, but we're maintaining SB 10 and SB 12 for now. But I can see that changing when the new energy code comes out. There's consideration also to design our homes to be more tornado resilient because we're seeing a lot more tornadoes in our neighborhoods. The requirements that go hand in hand with this are quite comprehensive. If we put it into our building code, we all have to design to it. So, there's clearly going to be some major structural design requirements that have to be hashed out before it can be adopted into our code. And then there's rumor on septic systems, chamber systems, leaching beds. We foresee that there'll be some changes coming through on that. So that is it for my presentation. Thank you everybody for participating. I hope you learned a lot. It was a lot of information, overload dump, but I'm always available for questions and I'm going to turn it over to Felix and open up the chat question here to see if we can get some questions answered here.
Great, Megan, thank you very much. Yes, there are quite a few questions already posted into the Q&A window. Megan, if you would like to go through it, that would be perfect. And just to our members, if you have questions, now is the time to post it there. Megan is going to address all these questions now.
Thank you. I'm just trying to find those questions here, Felix. Bear with me.
Sure. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom bar.
Okay, 1 second here. Seem to have lost. Okay. Q&A. Oops. Q&A, there we go. Okay, this over here. Okay, so secondary suites within a house. Not required fire rating or separations between secondary suite and main dwelling unit. Are there any changes to required SDC rating between these two dwelling units? I have not heard of any changes to the SDC requirements, so those will remain as they currently are. Only one fire exit for 6-story residential building will also be applied to OBC similar to BC. BC has not actually adopted this requirement. There's a lot of talk in the industry about single exits for mid-rise buildings. There is no actual BC requirement yet. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of rumor, but we haven't seen BC actually publish anything in its code that says that this is allowed. So we're following it. We're trying to see if we support it. But right as of now, Ontario is listening, but not adopting. And BC, take note, has not adopted yet either. Next question. Exit stair doors, 2012 code allowed for an 813 millimeter width specified in the appendix. New code does not have this exception. What is the new stair width? And is this a clear width? Okay, so I believe the stair width, those remain unchanged. I don't know what those requirements are off the top of my head, but I can tell you that when we measure clear width, it does not include the handrail. So we're measuring from outside stringer to outside stringer for those stairs. And the idea is that your body can overlap the handrail. The handrail will kind of hit you at waist height, but your shoulders can spread over that handrail. So that's why we measure beyond the handrail, assuming that they don't impede more than the allowable dimension. Date applied for permit. Does the application need to be deemed complete by the building department as far as the defined date for application? I don't believe so. Don't hold me to this. I don't believe so. I believe it's the date that you actually just get a building permit number. So I'm not sure if you can get a building permit number if your package is not complete. Again, we're trying to avoid those napkin sketches. Hopefully this grace period will give you some lenience in that if the building department deems your drawing not complete, you can take the week to make it complete and still be governed by the old code. Yeah, I don't know the answer directly for this one. Only time will tell, I guess, when we get to local jurisdictions, and they may choose to, rule it differently. March 31st, 2025, grace period for 2012. Will there be an official interpretation of substantially complete working drawings? No. Unfortunately, I wish, but this is at the discretion of your local authorities. That's why I recommend that you open up the conversation with your authorities now. Show them your drawings, phone them up and say, look, you know what? We're really hustling to get in our drawing package for December 31st, but we're not going to make it. We don't want to rush our design. We don't want to give you an incomplete package. This is where we're at today. Look, we're clearly going to be substantially complete by December. You have that on record if you email them even, and you can state that, look, we're targeting this date, and then maybe then they'll give you some documentation. But again, it's going to be dependent on each jurisdiction and how they navigate through that. All I can suggest is communication. If you communicate with them, they should be receptive to it. When is the OAA releasing its official matrix for the new 2024 OBC? I can't answer that. I'm not part of the OAA. Felix, I don't know if that's a question you can answer or direct people on who can answer that one.
I can definitely direct it and get back to you.
Perfect. Okay. For the December 31st, 2024 substantially complete, are there any formal documents we need to have in place? Okay, I think I've answered that. There's nothing formal. Like I said, just communicate with your local authorities. Will the online code from the government website still be available? Absolutely. So when you say online, you can go online and download a PDF that will be open indefinitely. Access to a building code online will not be available. So that's the ELAW's website, and they are decommissioning it for the new code. So you will have to have a downloaded version of it on your computer. Is the Tracks app going to be updated? I don't know. I don't run Tracks, so can't speak to that. Tracks, for those that don't know, is a new kind of AI platform that's intended to interpret the code, and a lot of building officials are looking to follow it. We've been playing around with Tracks. It's not quite there. From my perspective, I was kind of hoping it would do my job as a code consultant. So if I punch in all my information, it could tell me, spatial separation, what I need, and it just referred me to a section. So right now we're using Tracks as kind of a comparison tool. It's really good if you say, what is the difference for fire stop between the 2012 and the 2024? And it'll pull out all the requirements and do a comparison analysis for you. So that's pretty fantastic in that regard. It's also a really good summary tool. We use it if I say, give me all the requirements applicable to carbon monoxide alarms, and it'll find all of them in the code, summarize all the requirements for you into a beautiful bullet list. So you can make sure that your review is comprehensive. But I can't speak to when Tracks is going to be updated or what its capabilities are because I'm not an employee of them. Will SB10 be updated beyond the current state of the OBC 2024 PDF? What generation of the NECB will be referenced? I don't know that answer off the top of my head. The addition of the National Energy Code, you'll have to refer to the table in part 1 of the 2024 to see. I imagine it would be whatever edition is currently enforced because I know that they're proposed publishing a new edition of the NECB. But SB 10, it will update as the new energy codes are released, I'm assuming, unless they propose to decommission it and just adopt the energy code. I don't know what the idea is with this because I practice in fire and life safety and I do not delve into energy efficiency. So all I know is what I hear, and my experience with codes. So all I can say is follow that one, check your codes to see what edition, and if there's an amendment that comes out, it will identify which edition you should follow. I'm sorry if this was already answered, but will you be getting a copy of the slides afterwards? Absolutely. I always provide a copy of my slides. This is your checklist. That's why I put code references on. I believe Felix said that a copy will be distributed. So Felix, I leave that to you to coordinate on getting slides to your team here. Question, is dining hall kitchen in a workers a Part 3 building? A dining hall kitchen in a workers, a Part 3 building. So if you have, I assume a workers camp is the question here. If you have a workers camp and you have a dining hall and a kitchen, if the use of that building is solely for purposes, its primary use is a dining hall and kitchen, then yes, it's an assembly occupancy. However, if it's a camp for workers, it includes kind of a residential component, or I'll flip it to like a dormitory, like a residential university dormitory where you have essentially apartments, but you've got a ground floor dining hall. For purposes of construction though, I always think of those dining hall kitchen spaces as ancillary. And if they're ancillary, they're not a major occupancy. And the way I differentiate between ancillary and major occupancy is I say, could the building sustain if I took away the other occupancy? So in that dormitory university residence example, if I took away the dining hall, would the residence still operate as a residence as Group C? Yes, it would. You would still have that residence. However, if I took away all the residence rooms and only had the dining hall and kitchen, would it still function? And I would say, no, it wouldn't. The dining hall is there to support the residents. So in that case, I would not consider it a major occupancy. So then it could live in Part 9 because it wouldn't be assembly. If we're converting an existing small commercial to a restaurant, do we need to have an elevator? The code requirements are that if you build a new floor or a new mezzanine, you have to make that area accessible. So you have to put in an elevator to support that. So if you have a 3-story building, you put a 4th story on it, you have to have an elevator serve that 4th story to make it accessible, assuming it needs to be accessible, but you don't have to have that elevator serve 1st, 2nd, and 3rd floor. Not good practice, but you're not required to by code. So it really depends on the extent of your construction. And if you're building new floor systems, then you need to have an elevator. So most barns used for a wedding will need to be more than 400 meters squared as per 32228, since they typically have one access path. I believe is a statement. I don't know what the question is. So most barns used for a wedding will need to be no more than 400 meters squared per 322, since they typically have one access path. Yeah, barns and weddings are very unique structures because the purpose of these is never really, it doesn't fit the bucket of the code really well. I always recommend going for a special occasions permit if it's a temporary event or a one-time event or infrequent event. It's more the complexity that lies in if you're using these barns for weddings on a regular basis, then yes, they are your conventional A2 occupancy, and they have to follow all of Part 3 requirements, including fire department access, water supply, fire hydrant locations, and what have you, and construction requirements. So if you don't fit 32228, you may have to upgrade your construction to support it and do your Part 11 evaluation to see what upgrades are needed. How can we demonstrate that the occupant load in a space would be less than the OBC table? You don't need to demonstrate. You can just state it. We see it often where we have a room that can fit 1,000 people, but really we only have 200 people. I've never actually had the city question our logic on this, but you could perhaps get a letter from the owner or the operator and say, look, we only have 60 people on staff. Everybody's going to be sitting at their office. If we had a town hall, we pull everybody in. We're not inviting outside vendors into our space. So usually if we would have to, we would get a letter from the owner or the operator of that space to define to the city what their kind of use of that space is. When roofs require fire resistance rating, this is considered fire protection of the supporting structure rather than fire separation of the floor below. So if your roof needs a rating, any load-bearing construction holding your roof up needs to have an equivalent fire resistance rating. So that would be your columns. And if those columns are being held up by the floor system below, then that floor system below becomes a load-bearing element supporting something required to have a fire resistance rating, and it trickles down. So if it's got a fire resistance rating, anything holding it up needs to have a likewise protection, okay? Fire separation is smoke separation. I hope I answered that question. If not, please retype. Can I please recap the changes to 322.17 regarding rating of the roof? Okay, so to reiterate, 322.17 was an exemption before that said if your building is sprinklered, you do not need to rate your roof. So if your construction requirements under 322, group C up to 6 stories said your roof needs, say, a 45-minute rating, you had to have a 45-minute rating. But then 322 said, but you don't need that rating if your building is sprinklered. You're exempt. So we didn't have to rate our roof if our building was sprinklered. However, we dropped 322.17. It no longer exists in the new code. So we no longer have that exemption. So now if our roof needs a rating, our roof needs a rating. Doesn't matter whether you're sprinklered or not. Okay, so the exemption was taken away to not rate the roof. If our townhouse is designed to Part 9, do we still have to comply with 32512 NFPA 13D sprinkler systems required? If you need sprinklers, you have to determine if you need sprinklers, then the sprinkler system does have to conform to NFPA 13D. So you don't have to comply to 32512 unless it's cross-referenced in Part 9, okay? Typically, Part 9 buildings are unsprinklered. We see it more often when we do these kind of 4-story stacked townhouse conditions, or just even a 4-story townhouse, which would fall under Part 3, right? So typically Part 9, we don't sprinkler those buildings. So unless there's a cross-reference back to 32512, you wouldn't need to sprinkler it. For occupied roof assemblies, does it include personnel for maintenance? No. Occupied roof are public or patrons of the building. Maintenance personnel are never considered occupied. Requirements for barrier-free entrances. Does this apply to entrances serving a single unit in a residential occupancy? No, because a single unit in a residential occupancy may be exempt. It may not be designed as a barrier-free accessible unit, so you wouldn't have to design the entrance to be barrier-free. So if we think of like a large apartment building where you have a lot of ground floor units, those units open up directly to the exterior. They may be entrance doors, but we don't need to design them to be barrier-free because only a proportional number of those suites need to be barrier-free. So the barrier-free suite, yes, but all other suites, no. Door width reduced to 850. However, the panic bar protection should also be taken into account. Absolutely. Any projections into that clear door width need to be accommodated. The maximum projection allowance is 100 mil into your clear door width for purposes of measuring exit width. So any hardware that's going to penetrate more than 100 mil will deviate from that 850 clear. Updated showers clause, does it apply to schools? Great question. I don't know. I think it just says where change rooms are applied and showers are provided. It may be for workers. You'll have to check that language. I'm not quite sure. But the code requirement, if it doesn't specifically say for workers, then yes, it would apply to schools. Is the adult size change table in Universal still required? In NBC, it is not. Yes, we still require the adult size change table in a universal washroom. Ontario kept its washroom requirements and its barrier-free requirements. Will OAA be providing the updated checklist they use to provide the main sections? I can't speak to what OAA is going to provide. Felix, can you take note of this comment from Julius Horvath, 1158, for your response item, please?
Yes, I do take a note. Thank you, Megan.
Is there any other help with the transition available? If you go online, there's lots of presentations available. Orderline has some. I think the ministry's put out a few different presentations, so absolutely. There's a lot of information out there, but it is a learning curve for all of us, including the authorities. So all I can suggest is communicate. We're all trying to figure this out. We don't fully understand the application of some of these requirements, so do your best and open up the doors to talk. Is fire caulked considered cast in place? No, fire caulked is not considered cast in place. Cast in place is essentially poured concrete around a pipe. Fire caulked would be when you have an opening and a penetration through that concrete hole. So you've got your opening through your concrete slab, you put your pipe in and you've got an annular space around that pipe. You fire caulk, or the correct terminology is fire stop, around that pipe. So what it's saying is if you're cast in place, you don't need fire caulking or fire stop. But if you aren't cast in place and you do have that kind of annular space or that gap around your conduit, then you would have to fire stop it. Oh, here we go. Then is dining hall, kitchen, and a workers' camp a Part 3 building? If a dining hall, kitchen, and a workers' camp is an independent structure, then yes, it would be a Part 3 building, Group A2. Am I able to share a copy of the presentation? Absolutely. Felix will coordinate that. I'm an architect that have worked on several homes which are large enough to be under Part 3. The code wasn't well designed for these large homes. I agree. Notably, floors must be non-rated fire separations. Will the code be updated for Part 3 single-family homes? Great question. We do a lot of work on larger homes. And yes, there are a lot of restrictions for these. Interconnected floor space is one of the requirements as noted. Fire department access to get you your fire truck within 3 to 5 meters of your entrance door means you have to design your driveway to withstand a fire truck. Water access, we do a lot of, fancy cottages up in Muskoka. So if we're making those a Part 3 building, then, it becomes quite difficult. I have not heard of any code changes to address these types of occupancies. They are kind of a square peg round hole with respect to code application. The city doesn't budge on these, and they do follow the full language of the code on them. All I can suggest is, we often see, and I don't like them, nobody wants a firewall on their home, but we do see it a lot. And I never felt like that was the intention of the code, is to bind the design and make them into 2 Part 9 buildings through a firewall construction. But these larger homes, there is an increased risk. There are ways to mitigate some of those risks, but yes, some of these requirements, there's no proposed changes for. Why are there no requirements for accessibility or washrooms in Group G buildings with an occupant load? Horse riding and grooming is often part of therapy for people confined to wheelchairs. Great question. I believe that under Group G, and I haven't looked through it too thoroughly, but I thought Group G did include provisions for barrier-free access. If not, then that's a really good point, and I can see a future amendment adopting it, because these buildings should not be exempt from barrier-free requirements. They should provide an inclusive environment, so I would hope that our code changes would evolve. For now, you can always suggest it as good practice, but I don't know Group G off the top of my head to know if I was pretty sure it covered barrier-free requirements, but it may not. Grade definition is different between OBC and NBC. Did OBC revise its definition, and how is grade determined? I don't believe that we had any changes to the definition of grade. Grade is measured as the ceiling of the floor that is closest to grade. You'd have to go look at the definition. I want to stay on target here with respect to code changes. So getting into code interpretations is a little bit, it'll take us a little bit more time, and we are pressed for time. So if you want to reach out to me directly, I can maybe answer that question for you. But I would suggest you look at the definition of grade, average grade, and first story, and those will give you definition on how to define what grade is. For renovations, Part 11, E or A, is there any changes regarding forcing all existing public washrooms to be accessible, or are they still discretionary? Thank you, Megan. Great presentation. Thank you. So the grandfathering section of the code, fundamentally, if you don't touch it, you don't have to touch it. Okay, so if you have existing washrooms, you are not obligated under the building code to upgrade those washrooms. Okay. You are not obligated under a tenant fit out even to put in a universal washroom. As long as your washrooms are sufficient in capacity, they can remain, and you're not required to upgrade them to be barrier free. So we see a lot of, say, non-conforming universal washrooms that are a bit smaller. They don't have an adult size change table. They're fine. They're still accessible. They just don't meet the current code requirements for accessibility. So we don't have to upgrade any of our washrooms to be accessible, only those that you touch. So if you propose to renovate it, then that new construction would be governed by the code, Part 3, and you would have to comply with all the barrier-free requirements therein. 3821 has changed how they round the 15% barrier-free unit count. Yes, by rounding down. This has actually not changed. This has been in the code for quite a while, and this will substantially have an effect. Are there any changes that will allow these buildings to be constructed without barrier-free units, or is this an unavoidable change? No. The intention here is to make it a more inclusive and accessible environment for everybody, so we will never see the code stipulate that you don't need to have it. There are exemptions to when you need a barrier-free path of travel, but there's never an intention that you round down to the point where you don't need to have a unit. The code is very unique. I suggest everybody read the appendix note to 3821, because it does say that you round down, which is kind of against some of the language that we go through typically in the code, where we always round up conservatively. Is there a change in the new code regarding radon? Yes, I believe there are changes. Some changes I didn't mention in this presentation are changes to radon, changes to seismic. Seismic's another big one. We've adopted the National Building Code requirements for seismic design. So definitely a lot more significant requirements than what Ontario currently had. Speak to your structural engineer. They will have a lot to tell you about this section of the code. But yeah, big changes in with respect to that. Where was I? Sorry, just scroll down on me. Felix, how are we for time here?
We have about 5 minutes left, Megan.
Okay, I don't think I'll be able to get through all of these questions in the next 5 minutes, but I will do my best. We've heard that there's changes per Part 9. There's changes to stair requirements. Are they rumors? Are they implemented? No changes to Part 9 for stairs. That was adopted under a previous edition of the building code. Haven't heard these rumors, so I don't anticipate them. Will every street in a Part 3 multi-residential building require a power door operator? No, only those that are barrier-free accessible need to have a power door operator. No changes proposed there. Can you provide general comments on Part 11? Has it been updated as well, and does it apply in the same way as it does now? No changes to Part 11. Part 11, as we know and love, remains the same. And does it apply the same way it does now? Yes, it does. Yep, no changes there. I think BC changes allowing the design and construction single came into effect on August. Yes, but thank you for this link. I will check that. But if you actually go to that link, there's no actual code requirement. It says that they have adopted it, but we can't find that code requirement. So I will take that link. Thank you for that. I will research it. My office is currently talking about it. We had a discussion last week and we could not find a link to the actual code requirements to permit a single exit, just rumor that they've adopted it. We've had alternative solutions require roof vents connected to fire alarm when we put standpipes in the stairwell. Will this govern aspect of the new OBC? Yes, I believe that there are requirements for roof vents. I don't know about connection to fire alarm system. Roof vents connected to fire alarm when we put standpipes in the stair. I don't know. I haven't seen that requirement. I'd have to go back and check on that one. What will govern this aspect in the new OBC? I'd have to look into that. I would suggest you check the standpipe requirements. We adopted the National Building Code requirements for standpipes. So, there aren't any changes to it. It's just the fact that we adopted it. So if you've worked on any federal buildings, what was imposed for them will be imposed for all Ontario buildings. Are public stair shafts and transit station considered interconnected floor space if the opening exceeds 20 square meters? Great question. Stairs are actually exempt in transit stations, and this aligns with kind of the language for NFPA 130. We want those stairs to be wide because they're going to facilitate egress from these platforms, right? People have to get out of these stations quite quickly, so we need those wide stairs. So I don't believe that they have the size limitations and that exemption. This is a Part 3 requirement under 328 versus transit facilities being governed under 313. So we wouldn't have to apply that requirement to the transit station. Universal washroom section still the same? Yes, it is. No changes. Can you explain once more communication stair interconnected floor change? For reference, we are currently designing a stair over 4 levels, but only have ground to second completely interconnected, and upper levels have the atrium enclosed by glazed portions. Okay, so this would be an exemption you would be allowed because you've enclosed it and you've protected it at the 3rd and 4th floor. You're no longer interconnecting your 3rd and 4th floor with your 1st and 2nd. So your 1st and 2nd would hit that exemption of interconnecting not more than the 1st and 2nd. So really what you've got is you've got a really high ceiling space for that atrium space, and it's not interconnected with the 3rd and 4th. So you would still fall under that exemption and you would be okay. Will recording of this webinar be distributed? Felix, I understand that you'd make this available.
Yes, we will.
Thank you. 3811 exempts houses and triplex from Part 3.8. Will this also apply to fourplexes now permitted by zoning? Yes, because a fourplex, I believe, is considered a townhouse, and townhouses are exempt from barrier-free requirements. Does the blanket 1 in 12 max slope also apply to Part 3.8? Yes, that is the conventional ramp slope for barrier-free. What is the limit or use of a Lulu lift except the height? You'll have to dig into the standards for that. I don't think the height is limited under the building code. It'll still cross-reference you to the elevator standard, which may limit you on the height for a Lulu lift, but I don't think that prescriptive requirement was pulled into the building code. If there's a regression in the code, for instance, the door from 860 to 850, is it fair to assume that any future renovations of a space would not need to meet the previous requirements specific to that requirement and could be narrowed unless there were reasons that the widths needed to be maintained, such as required exit widths? Yeah, your future is 850. So yeah, you could, you just have to design to what's in the code at the data permit submission. So, if you choose to go to 860, that's great. If you stick with the 850, there's nobody to say that you can't do so. Okay. I have, Felix, is it okay if I go for 2 more minutes? Because I only have I have quite a few questions. No, I won't be able to get to it, everybody. My apologies for those that I missed questions. It is 12:30, so that does terminate our presentation. My QR code is on the screen, so feel free to, take a snap of it and, reach out. We are your code consultants. We are friends. I like to educate and I like to share my knowledge. So any questions you might have on this presentation, I'd be happy to share. Thank you all.
Great, Megan. Thank you very much for a great webinar, a great discussion, and going through so many questions during the Q&A session. Thanks also to everyone who attended. And as we conclude this webinar, I would like to draw your attention to just some announcement. The next webinar takes place next week on the 3rd of October with the title Electronic Document Authentication Requirements, What You Need to Know and How It Works. The OAA will report your participation in this webinar to your transcript. Therefore, there's no need for individual reporting. Additionally, all attendees will soon receive the presentation file via email along with a link to provide your feedback. Once again, thank you very much for your attendance and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, Megan. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Felix. Thanks, OAA. Have a good one, everybody.
Bye.